Assalamu alaikum. Now we're turning to our third topic of the day, and it's by Ammar Fairdous, who is from Mecca and who is studying for a PhD at UEA here in Norwich. And I wanted to stress that because Ammar's talk is from his PhD, and there's no accidental material. It is all very carefully and fully referenced, and has to meet his supervisor's criteria. This material was presented on behalf of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies in the Muhammadiyah University in Indonesia, in a major conference along with Sheikh Omar Vadio and quite a number of other scholars, some Arabic scholars. And it's on the history of usury in the Jewish and Christian religions, particularly in Europe. And I think it will go on to examine its history among the Muslims. And that's really what I'd like to say about that. So I'll hand it over to Ammar. Bismillah.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما فقهنا في الدين. اللهم إنا نسألك الإخلاص في القول والعمل وحسن الختام عند انتهاء الأجل. I would prefer to start my speech today with a hadith, a sahih hadith, عن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله تعالى عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, that which means you would treat the same path as was trodden by those before you, inch by inch and step by step, so much so that if they had entered into the hole of the lizard, you would follow them in this also. The companions, the Sahaba, said, Allah's Messenger, do you mean Jews and Christians? The Prophet ﷺ said, who else? This is from Sahih Muslim. And if you can see in the background, it's the lizard parrot. But isn't it our life today demonstrates the truthful of this prophecy? I mean, not only in economic, in every aspect of our life. However, today I'm going to talk about usury and what path we was trodden by. In recent decades, Islamic jurists have taken the industry of Islamic banking and finance to task on the grounds that the contractual form offered by Islamic banks present a de jure distinction that lacks a de facto difference from their conventional counterparts. This is well attested in many of the Islamic banking financial instruments, which are, in a sense, simple classical contracts that have been restructured into complex contractual form in order to achieve a similar end to explicitly interest-based transactions. Islamic banks, with the help of the Bayt Sharia board, have devised a number of financially engineered and carefully structured arrangements through which the risk of failure is borne entirely by the customer, while the bank receives a fixed rate of return at the end of the contractual period. This rate of return, furthermore, is very often based on a benchmark interest rate such as LIBOR. Thus, in the course of time, wealthy Islamic banks become progressively richer, whilst the poor customers become poorer and poorer, as is the case with the conventional banks. Yet, this practice has not been without its critics, who often assert that Islamic banking finance is merely a semiotic cloaking device intended to disguise the charging of interest, i.e., the substitution of profit rate or markup rate for interest rate. The proponent of Islamic banking, on the other hand, reject this view, alleging that these restructured transactions are fully Sharia compliant since it is the contractual form rather than the commercial substance that counts in Islamic law vis-a-vis commercial transactions. Interestingly, however, the argument with regard to what constitutes interest is not confined to the Muslim world. Both Talmudic and canon law in their respective histories imposed severe restrictions on charging interest, which both Jewish and Christian lenders long sought to circumvent. Although Islam may appear as the only religion in the Abrahamic stable that maintains a prohibition upon usury at present, yet this distinctive was not always the case. Both Judaism and Christianity have a long and varied history of opposition to the practice. It is the purpose of this presentation, therefore, to trace the teachings on usury and its theological interpretation in the scriptures of the people of the book in order to examine their relevance to the development of lending and credit law in the pre-modern and modern world. Of course, with particular regard to the development of the Islamic banking industry today. Usury in Judaism and Christianity. We will start with usury in Judaism. Jews and usury. In Surah An-Nisa, ayah number 161, Allah Almighty said regarding the Jews that which means that they took usury though they were forbidden, and that they devoured men's substance wrongfully. We have prepared for those among them who reject faith a grievous punishment. It might be noted that, unlike Surah Ar-Rum, ayah 39, in which usury is linked with the verb give, ataytum, in this ayah, when usury is related to the actions of the Jews, the verb take is used instead. This would indicate the tendency of the Jews to act as bankers, as takers of riba, rather than as buyers, in the Medina community of the time as well as throughout the history. The usurious practices of the Jews appear to have incited opprobrium from a very early date. A papyrus from ancient Egypt, dated at 41 AD, shows Heraclides, a young man, being advised to be careful with moneylender, and especially not to fall into the hand of the Jews. Jewish moneylenders were also infamous in the Muslim world of Babylonia. Ibn Taghri, an Egyptian historian, writes that in 98 AD, Muqtadir Billah, the Abbasid Caliph, created a register of Jewish bankers. Muqtadir Billah himself used to borrow 30,000 dinars per month from two Jewish bankers to fund the infantry in Baghdad, the capital of the empire at the time. They had been held notorious as usurers across medieval Europe as well. At the time, the Catholic Church had strictly enforced a ban on Christian involvement in usury, whilst acknowledging the right of Jews to engage in the practice. According to some historians, the Church turned a blind eye toward Jewish usurers in order to enable the papacy to continue raising funds for the greater good of crusading success. Of course, without directly exposing Christians to the taint of usury. At any rate, the ban left Jews in an advantageous position with respect to the entire credit market across Europe. The Jews were also involved in money lending activities under Ottoman dispensation. Many of the cases cited in the Jewish responsa literature, as well as in Turkish archives dated from the 16th to 18th century, attest that Jewish creditors operated on a large scale in both Arabic and non-Arabic speaking lands. They were not only selling interest loans to Muslim in villages, as mentioned in one responsum, but also financing merchants, prominent personages, and sometimes local governors. At the present time, it can be observed that of the 7 Federal Reserve Board governors, 4 are Jews, and of the 12 Federal Reserve District Bank presidents, 4 are Jews. Against this background, the question may arise as to why Jews in general tended to be so intensively involved in financial activities during much of their history. Part of the answer is to be found in the position of the Torah and other Jewish writings on lending money for profit. While both canon and Islamic law largely excluded medieval Christians and Muslims from taking interest, the Jewish law appears not to act in the same way for Jews. Dealing in usury seems to be opposed by very few real obstacles. Questions as to how such dealing were justified and whether or not lending money for profit is permissible under Jewish law can only add to these controversies noted above. Since in this section we will be dealing primarily with Jewish law, a brief introduction to the nature and sources of Jewish law would be appropriate. Jewish law is known as halakha. The term is derived from the Hebrew root halok, which means to go. It implies the path or the way in which a Jew should conduct himself in order to comply with God's will. As a legal system, halakha originates in different sources. The first and primary sources of Jewish law is of course the written Torah, or Torah, the 5 books of Moses, peace be upon him. The written Torah is the origin and constitution of Jewish law. The second major source is the oral Torah, the Talmud, which consists of the Mishnah and Gemara. These are reductions, interpretations, and extensions of the written Torah. The final major source of halakha consists of the responsa, or al-fatawa, which are the legal opinions that are issued by rabbis, scholars, or heads of academies in response to questions addressed to them. All of these 3 sources, along with the legislation and custom, comprise the main body of halakha. Hence, it will be important in trying to move toward a Judaic understanding of usury to address in some detail the concept of usury as found in the Torah, the Talmud, and the rabbinical commentaries. usury in the Torah or Torah. The Torah includes 3 statements of the law prohibiting interest. The most famous and comprehensive of these statements is that found in Deuteronomy 23rd, 2021, which reads, "You shall not lend upon interest to your brother, interest on money, interest on victuals, interest on anything that is lent on interest. To a foreigner you may lend upon interest, but to your brother you shall not lend upon interest, that the Lord your God may bless you." Here, the prohibition includes not only money or food, but also anything is lent for interest. Curiously enough, the Hebrew word used for interest in this passage is nishek, which literally means bite, as in a snake bite. According to more than one Jewish commentator, this term is used because the victim of snake bite would feel slightly uncomfortable at the initial stage, but later the venom spread throughout the entire body till it reached the vitals. So too with interest, which at first might be bearable, but with time it accumulates to become a tremendous sum, leaving the lender in an irrecoverable situation. It is interesting to note in this analogy the Jewish social attitude toward interest. This also might be more evident in the rabbinical literature, in which, for example, a Jewish man is allowed to lend to his wife or his son at interest only to let them know the taste of usury. Only to let them know the taste of usury. Usury in the Talmud. Because of the severity of the Torah prohibition against usury, the rabbis, Jewish scholars, took it upon themselves as a precaution to ban any payment or transaction which contain either a hint of increase or an earned profit that might accrue to the creditor. The Talmud extended the interest prohibition to include markups for credit sales, future sales, fixed rate of return in partnership agreements, any gift intended to influence the giving of a loan, any gift or service given in thanks for a loan, and praising, complimenting, or offering a blessing to the lender while the loan remained outstanding. All these were seen by rabbis as prohibited forms of usury. In fact, Jewish authorities went so far as to forbid a borrower from greeting his creditor in an unusually effusive manner. Some even state that the borrower should not even say thank you to the lender. They call that verbal usury. He should not say thank you to the lender. Others, however, allow a simple thank you, of course. However, it's very important to note that all these rabbinical laws are limited in their application to transactions between Jews. When transacting with a Gentile or non-Jew, a Jew may agree to pay or charge interest without restrictions. Likewise, in Deuteronomy, the Talmud put it in explicit terms that money may be borrowed from Gentiles on usury and lent to them on usury. And the same applies to a resident alien. This is entirely consistent with what Allah Almighty said with regard to the Jews in Surah Al-Imran, ayah 75. That which means that is because they say, we will not be taken to task for whatever we may do to non-Jew. To summarize, the Jewish rabbis appear to interpret the biblical teachings on usury in a fashion that permits the taking of interest from Gentiles while prohibiting the same from fellow Jews. Nevertheless, they developed several legal devices in order to evade the prohibition of taking interest even from fellow Jews. Throughout the centuries, Jewish borrowers and lenders found various ways to circumvent the prohibition on rebate or interest. These including revocable sales or phantom sales and transactions through non-Jewish intermediaries, but the most famous nowadays is the Eta Iska, which is a relatively complicated form of equity partnership that serves as the basis of most loan or loan-like transactions between Jews today. We might come to this Eta Iska later. But now, revocable sales. Revocable sales are a legal fiction involving a loan and a sale, as in the case where a person wishes to borrow $100 for a year and the creditor wishes to receive $110 a year later. In this case, of course, it would be unlawful to enter into an open agreement to lend $100 in return for repayment of $110 because it involves a loan with a stipulated benefit. Instead, the Jewish lender would sell the borrower an item of trivial value for a price equal to $10 due in a year, and then lend him the principal amount, this resulting in a net obligation on the borrower to repay the lender the desired return. For example, I sell my pen to you for 120 dirhams with the money to be paid in a year's time. And then I buy it back for 100 immediately. I kept my pen. You have in effect borrowed 100 dirham for me for a year at 20% interest. This is actually what is known in fiqh as bay'ul 'ina, or what is described in modern Islamic banks under the name of tawarruq. It is interesting to note that this interest masking transaction was devised originally by Jewish money bankers, not by Muslims. Furthermore, it is not only Islamic banks that have Sharia board today. It's not only Islamic banks that have Sharia board today. There are many banks in Israel and even in the United States that serve religious Jews, that employ boards of rabbinical advisors to approve of all transactions and then restructure those transactions that fail to meet the halakhic requirement. The most prominent example is a bank in Bali Taimur known as the Bank Vad Hakashas. This is another bank in UK actually, a Jewish bank in UK called Mizrahi Bank. It is the fourth largest bank in Israel with around 140 branches. On their website they said they're serving the needs of Israeli clients with business activities, catering to the needs of the UK Jewish communities. In other words, they have their own Sharia board or halakhic board who approve certain financial masking transaction actually. Let us turn our attention now to usury in Christianity. In fact, the church adopted a hostile attitude toward usury during the majority of its history. There was a time when Christians who asked more than they had given were under pain of refusal of confession, absolution, and Christian burial, or the invalidation of wealth and excommunication. Any interest charge greater than zero was regarded as usurious. Even hoping for anything beyond one's principle was declared sinful. They call it mental usury. So the Jews have verbal usury, Christians have mental usury. Charging interest was equated with the crime of theft, murder, fornication, and heresy. It was considered to be a form of avarice, a moral evil, inherently unjust, and a sin against Old and New Testament alike, as well as against natural law for the majority of its history. But the practice today is no longer regarded with quite such dread. The morality of interest-taking seems to be a foregone conclusion against most Christians. They may lend or borrow money at moderate interest rate with a clear conscience. This remarkable reversal of attitude raises awkward question for the Church. Did she err or simply change the teaching on usury? Is it the only teaching that has been changed due to changing circumstances, or have there been others? How could a divine law that is derived by revelation as holy, just, and good be subject to such modifications? It is the purpose of this section, therefore, to trace the historical development of the concept of usury and to indicate its successive connotations and their social and ethical significance from the biblical sources through the early fathers, the scholastics, the Protestant reformers, and the Jesuits to the current state of the Christian economic thinking. The New Testament sources. Usury was customary in the time of Jesus, peace be upon him. Ironically, one of the places where the practice flourished was in the temple in Jerusalem. As described in the New Testament, the corridors of the temple were crowded with money changers, who were not only dealing with coins of different denominations brought to the temple as a part of the tithes of Jews, but also allowing interest on money deposited with them. Hence, actually the temple of Solomon, peace be upon him, the house of God, become in effect the birthplace of the Jewish moneylender. One can look at the famous account of Jesus, peace be upon him, encounter with the money changers at the temple in this historical context. Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Curiously enough, Jesus, peace be upon him, equates money changing with theft in this famous passage. It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves. His attitudes appear to be derived from the fact that many of the money changers, besides exchanging coins, were involved indeed in interest-masking transactions, as evident in another of the teaching of Jesus himself, namely in Matthew 25:30, where Jesus, peace be upon him, used the term money exchangers to refer to usurious dealer. However, there are three other references to usury in the teaching of Jesus. Two are identical and relate to the parable of the talents. The third one is found in the Gospel of Luke. However, for the sake of brevity, I would refer you to the section on usury in Christianity in the supplementary material that will be distributed later, inshallah. Yet, it is important to note that these references has been the subject of considerable controversy among Christians throughout the history of the Church. However, the manner in which they were addressed, at least by the early fathers of the Church, was not inclined to tolerance. The early teachers of Christianity are known as the early church fathers. They are regarded to some extent as the Salaf of the Christians. Their opinions are fully honored by most Christian denominations. These fathers vehemently denounced usury in their writings, homilies, and moral sermons. They perceived it as unjust, immoral, evil, a snare of the devil, diabolical activity, injury to Christ, as well as a sign of disobedience that brings down God's wrath. Further, they depicted those involved in the practice as liars, lower than dogs, prolific wild beasts, predators, thieves, murderers, public enemies, menaces, serpents in the garden, eager for the downfall of the innocent for their own gain. And of course, there is no place for such individuals in the Lord's eternal tabernacle. Many other illustrations have also been used by them to demonstrate their absolute condemnation of the practice. Usury had no redeeming features in their eyes. The patristic prohibitions against usury distinguish neither between rates of interest nor between the purposes of the loans. Whatever exceeds the amount loaned was usury for them. But the only exception to the usury prohibition to appear in their sources is that provided by Saint Ambrose. Ambrose said, "Upon him whom you rightly desire to harm, against whom weapons are lawfully carried, upon him usury is legally imposed, on him whom you cannot easily conquer in war, you can quickly take vengeance with the hundredth from him extract usury whom it would not be a crime to kill. He fights without a weapon who demands usury. He fights without a weapon who demands usury. Without a sword he revenges himself upon an enemy who is an interest collector from his foe. Therefore, where there is right of war, there is also the right of usury." It cannot escape notice that this statement offers early evidence of the development of usury as a deadly offensive weapon. However, the lead of the early church fathers has been followed by the medieval scholastics. The economic teaching of the church, including the prohibition of interest, began to be widely debated within Christendom from the 12th century onwards. The group of academic scholars who discussed such matters are known as the scholastics, the most influential of whom was Saint Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas argued that the principal function of money is to serve as a medium of exchange. Thus, its principal use its consumption. I.e., one can use the money only by giving it away or by spending it on something. Money is consumed in its use, and like any other consumed in use commodity, its use cannot be separated from its ownership. For example, A cannot lend to B the use of 100 pounds and at the same time retain the ownership of it. Otherwise, B will not be able to use it. Therefore, a money loan can only be transacted through a contract that transfer the ownership of the commodity to the borrower, i.e., only through a sale contract. On this basis, Aquinas perceived and dealt with money loans as being, in a sense, an immediate sale of money in exchange for money to be received later. But if it would be unjust to sell 1 kilo of corn in exchange for 2 kilo of corn of the same quality, then it would also be unjust to sell 1 pound now in exchange for 2 pounds later. Those who argued that 1 pound extra is for the use of money neglected the fact that the money was incapable of being used apart from its being consumed. To ask for payment for the sale of a thing which not only did not exist, but which was quite incapable of existence, was tantamount to ask something from nothing, which is of course a violation of natural law. Aquinas says, in those things whose use is their consumption, the use is not other than the thing itself. Whence, to whomever is conceded the use of such things, is conceded the ownership of those things, and conversely. When therefore someone lends money under agreement that the money be integrally restored to him, and further for the use of the money wishes to have a definite price, it is manifest that he sells separately the use of the money and the very substance of the money. The use of the money, however, as it is said, is not other than its substance. Whence, either he sells that which is not, or he sells the same things twice. To it, the money itself, whose use it is consumption, and this is manifestly against the nature of natural justice. Excuse me. Different examples were given by Aquinas in order to illustrate the injustice of the practice. From his point of view, charging interest on loan is equivalent to charging for a bottle of wine and then charging the person again for using the wine to drink it, or charging for a kilo of wheat and then charging the person again who uses the wheat to consume it. This charging for usura, from the Latin for use, is obviously unjust. So from here the term usury arrived. This charging for usura, from the Latin for use, is obviously unjust. These and other arguments have been deployed by the scholastic in attempting to provide rational explanations for the rejection of usury. The ultimate conclusion drawn from these arguments is that usury is by its very nature unjust. Thus, to the scholastics, no interest could lawfully be claimed under the intrinsic title of the loan itself, i.e., it was usury to receive anything above the principal by reason of the loan itself. But the scholastic, or some of them, argued that under certain extrinsic title or conditions, the lender could be morally entitled to a return over the principal. They are called extrinsic titles because they were based on circumstance outside the loan itself. The most famous of these extrinsic titles were the following. I don't know how to pronounce it, but however, the bona conventionalis and interest C, which include dominum emergence and lacerum cedens, I think, deposit at discretion, or deposit at discretion. Chronologically, the first one widely used was the bona conventionalis, or a penalty for late payment. According to scholastics, delay in repaying a loan was a valid title to interest. They argued that it is just to punish negligent or fraudulent deferment of due payment. However, penalty for late payment could easily be used as a trick to circumvent the ban on interest. When the lender knew well that the borrower would not be able to retain the loan at the designated time, the penalty payment became but a disguised form of usury. Another extrinsic title approved by scholastics was interest, from which the word interest comes. The term interest derives its name from the word of the Justinian Code, 8 code interest, i.e. the difference between. By Roman law, if a debtor failed to make a payment when due, he could be forced to pay the creditor, in addition to the repayment of the loan, a compensation which is estimated by the difference resulting from the detriment to the creditor's financial position due to the default of the debtor. Once this difference is proved to have occurred, the lender becomes entitled to charge interest, or the difference between, in his financial position. However, the scholastics developed two extrinsic titles under which interest or compensation for the loss can be claimed. These titles are damnum emergence, or damage suffered, and lacerum cessans, or loss of income. In the former, the compensation is given to the lender when the delay in the repayment caused him to incur actual loss, whereas in the latter, it is given when the lender, by parting with his funds, misses an opportunity to make a profit elsewhere, or what modern economists refer to as opportunity cost. Another extrinsic title that was created at the time is deposit a discretion, or a deposit that yields a return payable by the bankers as a free gift. It has been argued that the Bible forbade usury, but it did not forbid bankers to be generous toward depositors and to pay them a specified return on their deposit. This, by the way, for sometimes was in Islamic banking. Some Islamic banks were providing such gifts to their clients at the end of the year. Along with these extrinsic titles, a dozen or more types of contract have been created through which usury is wont to be cloaked. Most famous was the contractum terinus, or literally triple contract. The triple contract involves the combination of three different contracts: a contract of partnership, a contract of insurance, and a contract of sale of profit. Individually, these contracts were deemed permissible by the church, but collectively it yielded a fixed rate of return from the outset. The way it worked was as follows. The lender would invest a sum equal to the amount of financing required, with the merchant on a profit and loss sharing basis. This is, by the way, very, very similar to Eta Iska, the Jewish Eta Iska interest masking transaction. So the lender would invest a sum equal to the amount of financing required, with the merchant on a profit and loss sharing basis. The lender then would insure his capital investment against loss by means of purchasing insurance, from the merchant himself. in return for an assignment of the probable future gain. Finally, the lender would sell to the merchant his share of the uncertain future gain resulting from the investment in exchange for a lesser but certain gain. However, the net result of these three concurrent and interrelated agreements is that the merchant bore all of the risk of failure, while the lender received a fixed rate of return at the end of the contractual period, regardless of whether the business had failed or succeeded. This tantamount to lending money at a pre-arranged guaranteed fixed rate of return, achieve a similar end with usury. Nevertheless, the triple contract received approval at the congregation of the Jesuits that took place in Rome in 1581. Henceforth, they become wholly committed to the defense of this contract and advocated its justice. Finally, the Protestant approach. It is important to note that for 15 centuries, whatever was added to the principle was deemed usury in Christian thought. Early church fathers, councils, canonists, popes, and scholastics draw no distinction between rates of interest or between the purposes of loans. All usury was damned and prohibited. The first to make the break with this tradition was John Calvin. In a letter to his friend, Calvin said that he didn't consider usury to be wholly forbidden among Christians unless it be repugnant both to justice and to charity. These principles, he argued, are not to be violated by charging a rich man for the use of money, especially in view of the new conditions and circumstances of economic life, wherein both creditor and debtor may gain by a loan at interest. Calvin's opinion that moderate usury on business loans and on loans to the rich are legitimate, but that the usury taken from the poor or taken at excessive or illegal rate is uncharitable, unjust, and therefore illegitimate. His new doctrine of the justification of taking reasonable usury or interest by modern definition initiated an era in which usury was not only legalized, but also started to be moralized, or to receive at least a religious sanction. The usurer's financiers could now point to an authority who supported their practices. Although this position was fiercely contested, especially by many English parliaments, by many English Protestant divine scholars and even Parliament for many years, it eventually found favor across the whole of Christendom, in practice if not in theory. To this day, most Protestant Christians believe that what is prohibited in the Bible is excessive interest or interest taken from the poor. Catholics also seem to believe in the same things. In greeting the National Council of Anti-Usury Foundations, Pope Francis defines usury as the practice of illegally lending money with a very high amount of interest. In the light of this study, it can be seen that the scriptural teachings of the people of the book are replete with passages containing either explicit prohibition of usury or unmistakable evidence that the practice was was scorned and strongly condemned. While these passages remain intact, the theological interpretations of many of them have changed over time in order to evade the strict usury prohibition. Misled by Calvin, Christians today separate the interest prohibitions from economics through the adoption of a theological interpretation that distinguishes, in theory, interest from usury. The former is accepted, whilst the latter is not. The taking of interest, therefore, is no longer a lively issue for most Christians today, although this was not the case for the greater part of their history. Jews, on the other hand, interpret the biblical teachings on usury in a fashion that permits the taking of interest from non-Jew and at the same time develops several legal devices to evade the prohibition of taking interest even from fellow Jews. Yet, Muslims appear to be not much better placed. Although they claim to adhere to their anti-usury teachings, many Islamic jurists or Islamic scholars on the payroll of the Islamic banks have adopted and adapted a wide range of financial instruments that violate the spirit but not the letter of these teachings. Exactly just like the medieval Christian and Jewish predecessors did. Furthermore, many of the Christians and Jewish medieval interest masking transactions, are identical, while others are very similar to the financial instruments that are to be found in the Islamic banker's toolbox today, but of course bearing Arabic and Islamic names like Tawarruq, etc. It would appear that Muslims are following the lead of the medieval formalistic approach to the law pertaining to usury. This is reminiscent of the famous hadith I mentioned earlier. The Prophet ﷺ also said in another hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, that which means, do not commit what the Jews committed, preaching what Allah has forbidden by resorting to the lowest type of hiyal or legal stratagem. Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, prohibited by al-Aina, narrated the following hadith that Allah Messenger says, a time is certainly coming to mankind when they legalize يستحلون the riba under the name of bay'ah, under the name of trade or sale. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu said, I heard the Prophet of Allah, may peace be upon him, say that which means, when you enter into the Aina transaction, hold the tails of oxen, are pleased with agriculture, and give up conducting jihad, Allah will make disgrace prevail over you, and would not withdraw it until you return to your original religion. Finally, returning to the question posed in the title of this presentation, are we following in the footsteps of the Jews and Christians? The question of course remains, but what is the alternative to these two options or to these two attitudes? What is the alternative? As we can see, today we have two groups of Islamic scholars. The first group following the leads of Christians by arguing that what is prohibited in Islam is not interest but usury. It's not the excessive rate of usury. Sorry, it's not the moderate rate of usury, but the excessive rate of usury. Some scholars today are arguing that, and by doing so, they actually following the lead of Christians, of Calvin. And we have the second group, on the other hand, following the leads of Jews, actually, by adopting and adapting many of the interest masking transactions, interest masking financial instruments that violate the law, violate the spirit of the law, but not the letter of the law. So what is the alternative to these two attitudes? The answer that is the essential challenge faced by the whole community, and as we said in our introduction this morning, the Muslim bear the leading responsibility due to the advantages of their religion. However, what we are doing now, right now, is the first thing, which is to study the entire terrain of action and identify salient features so that we can actually intellectually, strategically, and effectively in the establishment and the practice of our authentic deen. Thank you very much.